The rusted engine room looked beyond saving, until one quiet discovery made Grant stop reaching for the scrap pile. The bottle shattered against the railing with a blast of orange fire. Ranger lunged before Grant could shout, while sparks hissed across the weathered deck and a sharp metallic clang echoed through the stranded steamship. Somewhere beyond the smoke, footsteps disappeared into the darkness, but they had already left something behind. What do you think Ranger sensed before anyone else? The automatic doors of the Veterans Recovery Center slid open with a quiet hiss, releasing Grant Walker into the dry Arizona afternoon. The sunlight was sharper than he remembered. It always was after months spent inside buildings where every hallway smelled faintly of disinfectant and stale coffee. He paused on the sidewalk, one duffel bag hanging from his shoulder, his truck keys resting heavily in his palm. Beside him sat Ranger, a broad-chested German shepherd whose muzzle had begun to gray around the edges. The old military dog watched the parking lot instead of his owner, ears rotating independently as if cataloging every sound. A pickup backfired somewhere across the street. Grant's shoulders tightened before he even realized it. His eyes swept automatically. Roofline, second-story windows, parked vehicles, escape routes. The reflex was gone as quickly as it came, but not before Ranger pressed his nose gently against Grant's hand. Grant looked down. "I'm good," he muttered. The dog didn't move. He never believed those words. Neither of them did. The truck waiting in the visitor lot had nearly 300,000 miles on it. Its faded blue paint had surrendered years ago to sun and dust, but the engine still turned over with the stubborn reliability Grant appreciated. Inside were nearly all the possessions he still owned. 2 duffel bags, a toolbox, a sleeping bag, several Army photographs he hadn't looked at in years, a metal case containing service medals that remained unopened. Grant tossed the bags into the truck bed before opening the passenger door. "Mount." Ranger climbed in without hesitation. The familiar routine settled both of them. Grant rested both hands on the steering wheel for several long seconds before starting the engine. No destination, no home, no family waiting, only another road. His phone buzzed before he could pull away. Ethan Holloway. Grant frowned at the unfamiliar name before answering. "This is Grant." "Mr. Walker?" "Ethan Holloway. I'm an attorney in Cedar Bluff, Utah. I've been trying to reach you for several weeks." Grant glanced toward Ranger. "I've been unavailable." "I understand." There was a respectful pause. "I'm calling regarding your grandfather, Arthur Walker." Grant blinked. "I never knew him." "That may be true, but according to his will, you're his only surviving heir." Grant said nothing. The lawyer continued. "Mr. Walker passed away 6 weeks ago. He left you one piece of property. I don't need charity. It isn't charity." Another pause. "It's a steamship." Grant actually laughed. A short, tired sound that surprised even him. "A what?" "A retired steamship named Iron Horizon." Grant waited for the punchline. It never came. It has been stranded outside the town of Dry Creek for over 40 years after the White Elk River changed course. Now he was genuinely confused. "So my grandfather left me." A steamship sitting in the middle of the desert. Silence stretched across the phone. Grant finally sighed. "I'll be there tomorrow." Utah unfolded before him mile after mile. The mountains slowly gave way to mesas streaked with red sandstone. Juniper bushes dotted endless stretches of cracked earth. The farther north he drove, the quieter everything became. Gas stations grew farther apart. Cell service disappeared. Even Ranger seemed calmer, watching the landscape drift past with quiet interest. Late on the second afternoon, they crested a low ridge. Below lay Dry Creek. It wasn't much. Perhaps 300 people. One diner, one church, a weathered grain elevator, a handful of clapboard storefronts bleached by decades of relentless sun. And beyond the town. Grant eased off the accelerator. The ship dominated the valley. Iron Horizon rested high above an ancient riverbank like a forgotten whale stranded by time itself. Its towering paddle wheel had long since stopped turning. Twin smokestacks pierced the blue Utah sky. The white paint had peeled into long ribbons that fluttered gently in the desert wind. For one impossible moment, Grant forgot to breathe. It didn't belong there. Nothing about it made sense. Yet somehow, it looked magnificent. Ranger stood with his front paws on the dashboard. His ears were pointed directly toward the ship. The Dry Creek Land Office occupied a building barely larger than a garage. Inside, Ethan Holloway greeted him with a firm handshake. "You made good time." Grant nodded. The paperwork took only minutes. Property deed, tax records, survey maps, everything transferred without ceremony. Then Ethan slid one final envelope across the desk. "This belonged to your grandfather." Inside rested an old brass key attached to a weathered leather tag. Iron Horizon Captain's cabin. Grant turned it over thoughtfully. "I still don't understand." Ethan smiled sadly. Arthur believed some things become valuable only after everyone else gives up on them. Before Grant could ask another question, the office door swung open. A tall man in an expensive gray suit entered with 2 employees following behind him. His polished boots looked strangely out of place against the dusty wooden floor. Victor Hale. Grant recognized confidence before he recognized the man. Hale smiled without warmth. "So you're the grandson." Grant remained silent. Victor looked through the window toward Iron Horizon. "I'll save you a lot of trouble." He reached into his jacket, pulled out a checkbook. "I'll give you $25,000. Grant raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "The wreck." Grant looked back toward the ship. "It isn't for sale." Victor chuckled. "It will be eventually." He leaned closer. "That old boat is nothing but termites and rust." Grant folded the deed. "So why are you offering 25 grand? For the first time, Victor's smile tightened. "Professional curiosity." Grant slipped the documents into his backpack. "I'll keep that in mind." Without another word, he walked outside. Behind him, he could almost feel Victor watching. The gangway groaned beneath Grant's boots. Dust coated every railing, every window, every forgotten corner. The ship smelled of dry timber, faded engine oil, and decades of silence. He chose an empty crew cabin near the center deck, just enough room for his sleeping bag, his backpack, a lantern. Ranger circled twice before lying beside the door. Night arrived quickly. The desert temperature dropped with surprising speed. Wind whispered through cracked windows. Grant slept lightly, as always. Then clang! A sharp metallic crash echoed somewhere above. Grant's eyes snapped open. His heart hammered. Before thought could catch up, muscle memory had already taken control. He rolled off the cot, dropped low, grabbed the flashlight beside his sleeping bag. Every nerve screamed the same warning he'd heard too many nights overseas. Contact. He moved silently toward the cabin door. But Ranger was already there. The old German shepherd stood absolutely still, not barking, not growling. Every hair along his back stood erect. His eyes never left the narrow staircase leading toward the captain's cabin. Somewhere above them, something moved. Grant raised one hand toward Ranger without taking his eyes off the staircase. The old German shepherd didn't need a command. He stayed frozen, muscles tight beneath his thick coat, ears aimed toward the upper deck. Grant clicked off the flashlight. Darkness swallowed the narrow hallway. He listened. Years earlier, in the mountains east of Jalalabad, silence had often been louder than gunfire. Men who survived learned to hear what others ignored: the scrape of leather, the shift of gravel, a single breath carried by the wind. Now all he heard was the old ship settling against the desert night. A slow groan, a loose cable tapping somewhere overhead. Then, nothing. He waited another full minute before switching the flashlight back on. "Easy," he whispered. Ranger glanced briefly at him, but refused to look away from the stairs. Grant climbed first. Each wooden step answered with a soft creak beneath his boots. The beam of light swept across faded wallpaper, cracked windows, and a long hallway lined with cabin doors hanging half open. Dust floated through the pale cone of light like tiny drifting stars. No footprints, no broken glass, no sign that anyone had entered. When he reached the upper landing, he stopped. The captain's cabin sat at the far end. Its heavy oak door remained shut. The brass lock was buried beneath decades of tarnish. Grant walked closer. The key Ethan Holloway had given him rested inside his pocket, but exhaustion outweighed curiosity. Whatever had made the noise hadn't forced the door. He shined the light across the ceiling. A rusted pulley near an old cargo hoist swung gently back and forth. One of its retaining pins had finally worked loose. The metal hook hanging beneath it had struck the deck. Clang. Simple. Explainable. Yet Ranger refused to move. The dog stared at the captain's door another several seconds before finally turning away. Grant noticed it. He didn't mention it. Old instincts taught him something else. When a trained military dog remained uneasy after the obvious explanation presented itself, there was usually another reason. Morning arrived in shades of gold. Sunlight spilled across the desert basin, washing the iron horizon in warm light that made the peeling white paint almost beautiful. Grant stepped onto the forward deck carrying a battered enamel mug filled with instant coffee. The silence felt enormous. No traffic, no engines, only distant meadowlarks and wind brushing through dry sage. Ranger was already awake. The German shepherd stood near the bow, studying the empty riverbed stretching toward the horizon. Grant followed his gaze. Hard to imagine water had once carried a vessel this size. The river had abandoned Dry Creek decades ago, leaving the ship stranded like a forgotten promise. He sipped the bitter coffee. "You and me both." Work began immediately. The crew cabin he'd chosen was barely livable. Broken boards littered the floor. Spiderwebs stretched across every corner. The mattress collapsed into dust the moment he dragged it outside. Grant opened every window he could. Fresh desert air pushed years of stale silence out of the room. He found an old push broom hanging inside a storage closet. Hour after hour, dust rolled across the deck in gray clouds. Ranger wandered quietly through the ship, checking each open doorway before returning to wherever Grant happened to be working. Always watching. Always close. Around noon, Grant pried loose a warped section of flooring near the galley. The hammer struck an iron support beam. Clang! The sound exploded through the empty ship. Before he could blink, his pulse surged. His breathing stopped. His body reacted before his mind did. He dropped instinctively behind an overturned cabinet, eyes scanning, searching rooftops that weren't there, calculating lines of fire inside an empty steamship sitting in the middle of the Utah desert. For one impossible second, the smell of old timber disappeared. In its place came diesel fuel, burned rubber, fine Afghan dust blowing through shattered concrete. Someone shouted over a radio. "Contact left!" Grant squeezed his eyes shut. His fingers tightened around the hammer until his knuckles turned white. Then, a warm nose pressed gently against his wrist. Ranger. The dog leaned against him without making a sound. Solid, steady, present. Grant exhaled slowly. The engine room returned. The riverbed returned. The silence returned. He rubbed one hand over Ranger's neck. I'm here. This time, he wasn't talking to the dog. By late afternoon, he'd cleared enough space to unroll his sleeping bag properly. He repaired one broken window using plywood scavenged from an abandoned storage locker. Water proved harder. The town well stood nearly half a mile away. Grant found 2 dented metal buckets below deck and carried them across the cracked earth. Several townspeople watched without saying much. One old woman sweeping outside the bakery offered only a small nod. A mechanic looked up briefly before returning to his work. No one mocked him, not directly, but every curious glance eventually drifted toward the enormous stranded steamship, as if everyone shared the same silent question. Why would anyone stay? That evening, the temperature dropped quickly. Grant heated canned stew over a small camp stove while Ranger waited patiently nearby. After dinner, they walked one slow lap around the ship. Grant inspected every support beam beneath the hull, checked each access point, verified the gangway remained secure, a habit born from years of securing temporary positions before darkness. Old routines died slowly. Inside again, he locked the cabin door, checked the windows, cleared every corner. Only then did he lie down. The lantern burned low. Outside, wind whispered across the empty basin. Grant drifted into uneasy sleep. A few hours later, his eyes opened again. No sound this time, just instinct. He listened. Nothing. Then he noticed Ranger. The German shepherd wasn't beside the bed. He sat outside the cabin door, perfectly still, facing the staircase, watching the captain's cabin again. Grant checked his watch. 2:17 a.m. The same direction. The same quiet intensity. The same impossible certainty. When dawn came, Ranger walked upstairs before Grant even finished packing away the blankets. He stopped beneath the captain's cabin, lowered his nose, inhaled deeply, then remained there. Grant frowned. That evening, the same thing happened, and the evening after that. Nothing changed. For 3 nights in a row, Ranger returned to exactly the same spot beneath the locked captain's cabin, as if something inside was waiting to be found. Grant never pulled the dog away. He had spent enough years trusting military working dogs to know one simple truth. They noticed patterns long before people did. If Ranger kept returning, there was a reason. He simply hadn't found it yet. Instead of forcing answers, Grant turned his attention to the problem that could actually keep them alive. The ship needed to earn its keep. Morning sunlight poured through broken skylights into the enormous engine room. Grant descended the narrow iron ladder carrying a lantern, though daylight already spilled through cracks in the hull. The room stole his attention. Twin steam boilers stood shoulder to shoulder like sleeping giants. Massive connecting rods stretched toward the paddle wheel housing. Every surface carried a blanket of dust, yet beneath the grime the steel remained surprisingly clean. Grant ran one hand across a flywheel nearly taller than himself. His fingers came away gray. No deep corrosion, no structural fractures. He crouched beside one of the boiler mounts. Old rivets, hand-forged, still tight. He tapped one lightly with a wrench. Solid. A faint smile touched his face. During deployments, he'd spent months maintaining generators, armored vehicles, portable water systems, and hydraulic equipment. Machines spoke the same language everywhere. Neglect looked different from failure. Iron Horizon wasn't dead. She had simply been waiting. Grant straightened. This'll work. Ranger thumped his tail once against the steel floor. By afternoon, the engine room had become a construction site. Grant dragged broken furniture outside. He stacked usable lumber in neat piles. Rusted tools were sorted onto one workbench. Anything beyond repair went into another. Organization came naturally. Every wrench had a place. Every bolt found a coffee can. Every scrap of wire was coiled neatly. Military habits survived even after uniforms were folded away. Sweat soaked through his faded green t-shirt as the desert heat climbed toward 90 degrees. Every few hours he stopped only long enough to drink water and check Ranger's paws against the hot deck. The old German shepherd followed quietly from one compartment to another, inspecting every space before Grant entered. Always first, always watching. Late that afternoon, someone cleared his throat behind him. Grant turned. An elderly man stood near the open cargo door. Thin, weathered, suspenders hanging over faded denim overalls. His hands looked like old oak roots. "You planning on bringing her back?" Grant rested the pry bar against the wall. "Planning on living?" The old man nodded slowly. "That's usually where rebuilding starts." He stepped inside without waiting for permission. "My name's Owen Briggs." Grant shook his hand. "Grant Walker." "I know." Owen glanced around the engine room. "So you're Arthur's grandson." Grant looked surprised. "You knew him?" "Knew enough." Owen walked toward one of the support beams near the bulkhead. Without saying another word, he pressed a thumb into the wood. The beam boom crumbled beneath the pressure. "There's your first problem." Grant joined him. The base had rotted where years of trapped moisture had quietly eaten through the timber. "If this lets go," Owen said, "part of your deck settles 6 inches." Grant nodded. "I'll replace it." "You'll try." The old carpenter smiled faintly. "Difference." For the next hour, they worked together without much conversation. Owen showed him how to brace the overhead weight before removing the damaged post. Grant listened more than he spoke. There was comfort in working beside someone who measured a man by his hands instead of his history. When the temporary support finally held, Owen wiped the sawdust from his palms. "You'll need better lumber. I'll figure something out." The old man simply tipped his hat and walked away. Grant watched him disappear toward a town. He doubted he'd ever see him again. The following morning, a pickup truck stopped beside the gangway. Grant stepped outside. Stacks of fresh-cut oak filled the truck bed. Owen climbed out. Mill had leftovers. Grant frowned. "You didn't have to." "I know." Together they unloaded every board. Not another word was spoken. Some debts were paid with conversation, others with lumber. By the end of the week, Iron Horizon looked different. Not restored, but alive. Dust no longer coated every floor. Sunlight reached deeper into the corridors. Broken doors had been removed. Several windows now stood open, letting fresh mountain air drift through the old vessel. Grant found himself breathing easier. The nightmares still came. Just not every hour. Children began wandering closer. Most stayed near the bottom of the gangway before running away again. Only one kept returning. A skinny boy with freckles and a baseball cap 2 sizes too big. He never looked at the ship, only at Ranger. The German shepherd noticed him immediately. The dog remained lying beside Grant's toolbox, but watched the boy from the corner of one amber eye. "You can pet him," Grant finally called, "if he comes to you." The boy swallowed. "He was in the army?" "Yeah. Like you?" Grant nodded once. The boy crouched slowly. Ranger studied him another moment before standing. His gait remained smooth despite his age. He walked directly toward the child. Stopped. Waited. The boy held out one trembling hand. Ranger sniffed it carefully. then leaned his head gently beneath the small fingers. A grin spread across the boy's face. "My name's Ben. I'm Grant." "I know." Ben laughed. "Everybody's talking about the soldier who bought the boat." Grant looked around the empty basin. "I didn't buy it." Ben scratched behind Ranger's ears. "Doesn't matter." He looked up at the towering ship. "I think it's pretty cool." Grant smiled. It was the first genuine smile that had crossed his face in longer than he could remember. That evening, Ben helped carry scrap wood into neat stacks before heading home. The desert sky glowed orange behind distant mesas. Grant watched the boy disappear down the dirt road. Ranger, however, had already turned away, his nose lowered, his ears stood upright. Without hesitation, the German shepherd climbed the staircase leading toward the captain's cabin. Grant followed several steps behind. Ranger reached the landing, walked directly to the same place beneath the locked door. Then, for the first time, he began digging furiously at the floorboards beneath the captain's threshold. Wood splinters scattered across the hallway. Grant hurried forward. "Ranger." The dog froze instantly, but he didn't move away. Instead, he stared at the floor, then slowly lifted his head toward the captain's cabin. His ears locked forward. Every muscle in his body suddenly went still, as though he'd finally found exactly where the truth had been hiding all along. Grant slowly crouched beside Ranger. The German shepherd's nose hovered only inches above the worn planks beneath the captain's door. His breathing remained calm, but his eyes never left the heavy oak barrier. Grant rested a hand lightly on the dog's shoulder. "What is it, partner?" Ranger answered only by touching the floor once with his paw. Not scratching, not digging. Pointing. Grant studied the boards. Nothing unusual. No stains, no loose nails. Just timber worn smooth by decades of forgotten footsteps. He looked up at the old brass lock. Then he remembered the key Ethan Holloway had placed in his hand. The key slid into the lock with surprising ease. Grant expected resistance. Instead, nothing happened. He turned it gently. The mechanism refused to move. 40 years of desert dust and oxidation had welded the tumblers into place. He tried again. Still nothing. For a brief moment, frustration rose inside him. Then training pushed it aside. Force usually created bigger problems than patience. He withdrew the key and knelt beside the lock. From the toolbox downstairs, he gathered a screwdriver, a small wire brush, penetrating oil, and a flashlight. The same quiet focus he'd once used to disassemble damaged field generators settled over him. One screw, then another. Years of hardened grime filled every slot. He cleaned each one carefully with the tip of a pocket knife before applying slow pressure. The first screw groaned, barely moved. Grant stopped, sprayed more oil, waited. Minutes passed. The desert breeze drifted through broken windows. Ranger never left his position. By late afternoon, the final screw finally backed free. Grant eased the brass lock assembly from the thick oak door. The metal dropped into his palm with a dull weight. He pushed gently. The door opened only an inch before stopping. Dust had sealed the bottom edge. Grant leaned his shoulder against it. Wood creaked. Air sighed through the narrow opening. The smell that escaped carried no mold, no decay, only dry cedar, old paper, and time itself. The captain's cabin had become a museum without visitors. Sunlight filtered through dirty windows, painting pale rectangles across the wooden floor. A narrow bed rested neatly against one wall. Its wool blanket remained folded with impossible precision. An oil lamp stood beside it. A cast iron stove occupied one corner. Across the room sat a broad oak desk facing the front windows where a captain would once have watched the river. Dust covered everything, yet nothing appeared disturbed. Grant removed his hat instinctively. He wasn't sure why. Perhaps because stepping inside felt less like entering an abandoned room, and more like walking into someone's memory. Ranger entered without hesitation. The dog moved slowly around the room, nose working quietly. He ignored the bed, ignored the stove, ignored the bookshelves. Instead, he stopped beside the desk. Grant smiled faintly. You and that desk again. He began opening drawers. Most were empty. One contained an old compass divider. Another held several dried fountain pens. Nothing valuable. Nothing mysterious. On top of the desk rested a thick leather journal. Grant brushed away decades of dust. Gold lettering slowly appeared. A. Walker Engineering Log. He opened the first page. The handwriting surprised him. Strong, neat, methodical. Not the writing of a dreamer. The writing of an engineer. March 14th. Pressure test completed. Starboard intake failed under sustained load. Requires redesign. Grant turned another page. Sketches filled the margins. Measurements. Flow calculations. Cross-sections of steel piping. His grandfather hadn't merely owned the ship. He had worked on it, lived with it, believed in it. The farther Grant read, the quieter the room seemed to become. Until suddenly, the journal skipped nearly 40 pages. He frowned. Someone hadn't torn them out. The pages had been carefully cut away with a sharp blade. Another section disappeared farther along, then another. Whatever story Arthur Walker had written, parts of it were missing. Outside, the afternoon sun slid lower over Dry Creek. Grant closed the journal carefully. I wish I'd met you. The words escaped before he realized he'd spoken them aloud. Ranger gave a quiet huff. Grant looked over. The dog wasn't listening. He was staring at the desk again. Slowly, Ranger stepped closer. He lowered his nose to the lower right corner. Not the top, not the drawer. The wooden panel beneath them. He sniffed once, twice, then scratched lightly. Grant crouched beside him. What do you smell? He leaned close himself. Nothing. Only dry oak. He tapped the panel with his knuckles. Solid. He checked underneath. No hidden latch. No visible hinges. He searched along the edges. Nothing. Yet Ranger refused to leave. The German shepherd pressed his nose against the exact same corner again. Grant watched carefully this time. The dog wasn't following a scent drifting through the room. His nose stayed almost motionless, as though the smell wasn't escaping into the cabin, but seeping through something. Grant slid his fingertips across the grain. His hand paused, almost imperceptibly. A cool thread of air brushed across his skin. He froze. The windows behind him were closed. The stovepipe was sealed. Yet something, somewhere inside the desk, was allowing air to pass. Grant leaned closer until his cheek nearly touched the wood. There it was again. Not enough to feel continuously. Only the faintest breath, as if the old desk were quietly exhaling after 40 years of silence. Ranger looked at him. Grant looked back at the desk. For the first time, he wasn't wondering what had been hidden inside the captain's cabin. He was beginning to wonder what had been hidden inside the captain's desk. Grant resisted the urge to tear the old furniture apart. Whoever had built the desk had done so with precision, and whoever had hidden something inside had intended it to survive. Breaking it open would destroy the very clues he needed. He rested both hands on the worn oak surface, and slowly examined every inch of it. The drawers, the frame, the joints, the grain. His fingertips traced the seams one by one, just as they had once traced damaged wiring harnesses inside armored vehicles halfway around the world. Every machine had a logic. Every craftsman left patterns. This desk was no different. Only this puzzle would have to wait. Outside, an engine echoed across the empty basin. Grant glanced through the dusty window. A black SUV rolled toward the ship, kicking up a long trail of pale desert dust. Ranger was already moving. The German shepherd stood beside the doorway, ears forward, body relaxed but alert. Grant recognized the vehicle before it stopped. Victor Hale. Victor climbed out wearing pressed jeans, polished boots, and mirrored sunglasses that reflected the iron horizon like an inconvenience. Two men remained inside the SUV. Neither got out. Grant noticed that immediately. Always leave someone with the vehicle. Old habits made him catalog details without thinking. License plate, mud on the tires, fresh scrape along the passenger door, a shovel lying in the truck bed. Victor smiled as though they were old friends, making progress. Grant folded his arms, trying. Victor looked toward the freshly repaired railing, then toward the engine room where neatly stacked lumber replaced piles of debris. "You've put in more work than I expected." Grant didn't answer. Victor reached into his jacket. Another envelope. Another offer. This time, it's $75,000. Grant almost laughed. A few days ago it was 25. Victor shrugged. "I've reconsidered." Grant looked directly into his eyes. "No." Victor's smile faded only slightly. "You haven't even asked why." "I don't need to. The ship's worthless." "Then why do you want it?" Silence settled between them. A warm breeze carried dust across the old deck. Victor finally sighed. "You're a practical man." Grant remained still. "I've read enough about your service record to know you understand logistics." That caught Grant's attention. Victor continued. "Hale Minerals recently acquired several thousand acres around Dry Creek." Grant said nothing. The ship happens to sit in the middle of future development. Grant glanced toward the surrounding basin. Miles of empty desert. Future development. Victor smiled again. "Exactly." Grant's expression never changed. "I still don't believe you." Victor removed his sunglasses. "For someone trying to start over, $75,000 is a good beginning." Grant looked beyond him. Ranger had quietly walked down the gangway, not toward Victor, toward the SUV. The German shepherd circled once around the rear bumper before stopping beside the driver's door. His nose worked steadily. Then he looked back at Grant. Grant noticed. So did Victor. "He doesn't like strangers," Grant answered calmly. "He likes honest ones." For the first time, Victor's smile disappeared completely. He slipped the envelope back into his jacket. "You'll change your mind." "I won't." Victor turned toward his SUV. "You'd be surprised how expensive old ships become." The vehicle disappeared in another cloud of dust. Grant watched until it vanished beyond the ridge. Only then did he kneel beside Ranger. "What did you find?" The dog sniffed Grant's hand once before walking back toward the ship. No barking, no growling, only another quiet warning. That afternoon, Grant repaired shelving inside the engine room. His hands worked automatically. His thoughts did not. Victor knew too much. He knew Grant's military history. He knew the ship's condition. He knew exactly where Iron Horizon sat. Most importantly, he wanted it far more than its appearance justified. Grant opened Arthur's engineering journal again. The missing pages bothered him even more now. If someone had removed them deliberately, why? As evening settled across Dry Creek, Grant carried 2 empty buckets toward the town well. People had begun recognizing him. A rancher tipped his hat. Nora Ellis, the owner of the small bakery, stepped outside carrying a paper sack. "You missed lunch." Grant looked surprised. "I wasn't keeping track." "I figured." She handed him the sack. Still warm. Fresh bread. A slice of peach pie. "You can pay me when you become rich fixing that boat." Grant smiled faintly. "I wouldn't hold my breath." Neither of them noticed Ben until the boy came running down the street. "Mr. Walker!" Grant turned. Ben slowed to catch his breath. "I saw those black SUVs again." Grant's expression sharpened. "When?" "Yesterday." "Where?" "They were parked by the old quarry." Ben pointed toward the western hills. "They stayed there for hours." Grant nodded once. "Thanks." The boy looked down at Ranger. "He doesn't trust them either." "No." Grant rested one hand gently on Ranger's neck. "He doesn't." Night settled quietly over the basin. Stars filled the sky with impossible clarity. Grant completed one final walk around Iron Horizon before turning in. Every habit returned naturally. Gangway secure. Windows checked. Toolbox locked. No fresh tire tracks. No footprints. Nothing unusual. Almost. Ranger suddenly stopped. His head lifted toward the darkness beyond the dry riverbed. The wind had shifted. Grant listened. Nothing. But Ranger didn't move. Several long seconds passed. Then, far below the ship, a faint orange glow appeared. Tiny, unsteady, moving. Grant narrowed his eyes. Someone carrying a flashlight. No. Not a flashlight. A covered lantern. Trying not to be seen. He quietly extinguished his own lantern. Every light aboard Iron Horizon disappeared. Grant stepped silently into the shadows beside the rail. Years of moving through hostile valleys without announcing his position returned without effort. No panic. No wasted motion. Only observation. Ranger stood perfectly still beside him. Neither of them made a sound. Below, the figure stopped beside the hull. Another shadow emerged from the darkness. Then another. Someone whispered. Glass clinked softly. Grant's eyes settled on the object being passed from one man to the next. Even in the moonlight, he recognized the shape immediately. A bottle, stuffed with a rag. And moments later, one of the men struck a match. The tiny flame bloomed orange against the darkness. Grant didn't move. Not yet. Years earlier, during night operations in Afghanistan, he'd learned that the first man to reveal his position usually lost control of the situation. Observation came before action. He counted. 3 silhouettes. 1 lookout. 1 carrying the bottle. 1 standing farther back near the truck, no firearms that he could see. The rag caught fire. The man drew his arm back. Grant whispered only one word. Down. Ranger immediately lowered himself beside the railing without making a sound. The bottle left the man's hand. It spun through the night. Grant lunged from cover. The bottle shattered against the edge of the lower deck instead of the cabin wall. Flames erupted across weathered planks. The smell of gasoline rushed upward. Without hesitation, Grant grabbed the nearest canvas tarp soaking in a rain barrel he'd filled earlier that week. He slammed it over the fire. Steam hissed into the night. The flames disappeared beneath the heavy canvas. The men below froze. One cursed, another pointed toward the deck. "He's awake!" Grant still didn't chase them. His attention stayed on the ship. Fire first, threat second. That order had saved lives before. He stamped out the last burning strip of cloth. Only then did he look over the railing. The three figures were already running. One scrambled toward the pickup parked beyond the dry riverbed. Another disappeared behind a cluster of mesquite bushes. The third hesitated. Ranger didn't. Without waiting for permission, the German shepherd launched down the gangway. "Ranger!" The dog never broke stride. Grant sprinted after him. Old injuries protested with every step, but training overruled pain. His breathing slowed instead of quickening. His eyes tracked movement instead of panic. The fleeing man glanced back once. That moment cost him. Ranger closed the distance in seconds. The German shepherd didn't bite. He cut across the man's path exactly as he'd been trained years before, forcing him to stumble sideways. The stranger swung a length of rusted pipe. Grant shouted, "Leave it!" Too late. The pipe crashed hard against Ranger's left shoulder. A sharp yelp split the night. The dog rolled once across the dirt before scrambling back onto three legs. Grant reached them an instant later. The attacker dropped the pipe and fled into the darkness where the waiting truck roared to life. Headlights bounced across the basin. Gravel sprayed beneath spinning tires. Within seconds, they were gone. Silence returned. Grant ignored the truck, ignored the fading taillights. His attention belonged somewhere else. Ranger stood trembling beside him. The old dog's front leg barely touched the ground. Grant knelt immediately. "Easy, easy, partner." His hands moved with practiced calm. He checked the shoulder. No obvious deformity. No bone pushing beneath the skin. Ranger leaned heavily against him, but never tried to pull away. Grant rested his forehead briefly against the dog's. "You stayed with me." Ranger answered with one slow wag of his tail. The lights of Dry Creek began appearing one by one. Someone must have seen the fire. Within minutes, a battered pickup stopped beside the ship. Owen Briggs climbed out carrying 2 buckets. "What happened?" Grant pointed toward the black scorch marks on the deck. "They tried to burn her." Owen looked around the basin. "See who?" "No." The old carpenter noticed Ranger standing awkwardly beside Grant. His weathered face tightened. "They hit him?" Grant nodded once. Owen quietly set down the buckets. "I'll fetch Caleb." Caleb Morris arrived carrying a large lantern and a heavy canvas tool bag. The blacksmith knelt beside Ranger without unnecessary questions. He gently felt along the shoulder. Ranger flinched, but stayed perfectly still. Tough old fellow. Grant watched every movement. "Broken?" "I don't think so." Caleb slowly rotated the leg. "Bad bruise. Maybe a deep muscle injury." Grant released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Caleb wrapped the shoulder with a wide cloth bandage soaked in cool water. "He needs rest." Grant gave a faint smile. "Try explaining that to him." For the first time that night. Caleb smiled back. Word traveled faster than sunrise in a town the size of Dry Creek. By morning, nearly everyone had heard someone tried to burn the Iron Horizon. Grant found fresh footprints around the hull, where curious neighbors had gathered before dawn. Some shook their heads. Some simply stared. Nora Ellis appeared carrying another basket. This time she didn't joke. She quietly placed sandwiches on the workbench. "You both need to eat." Grant thanked her. She reached down and scratched Ranger gently behind one ear. "You brave old boy." Ranger accepted the attention without lifting his head. Grant spent the entire day beside him. The repairs on the ship stopped. The engine room remained silent. He mixed fresh water. changed the bandage, checked the swelling every hour. Whenever Ranger shifted uncomfortably, Grant was already there. Late that afternoon, Ben rode up on his bicycle. He stopped halfway across the gangway. "I heard somebody hurt Ranger." Grant nodded. The boy walked slowly over. Without speaking, he removed the faded army patch sewn onto his own backpack. "My dad said heroes deserve patches." He carefully laid it beside Ranger's blanket. The German shepherd opened one eye. Ben smiled through damp eyes. "You get better." He climbed back onto his bicycle and quietly rode home. Grant watched him disappear into the evening light. Then he looked back at Ranger. The old soldier lay sleeping beside the engine room door. His breathing was steady. One paw twitched gently, as though chasing some distant memory. Grant settled onto the floor beside him. He didn't build. He didn't read. He didn't search the captain's cabin. He simply stayed. As darkness settled across the desert once again, the lantern burned softly beside them. Grant remained awake through every hour of the night. Not because the nightmares had returned, but because this time, someone who had never once left his side needed him to stand the watch. Grant remained awake until dawn. The lantern burned low beside Ranger's blanket, while the old German shepherd slept through the pain in short, restless stretches. Every so often, one ear twitched toward the darkness outside, as though years of military training refused to surrender to age or injury. When the first light crept through the engine room windows, Ranger opened his eyes. Grant was already watching him. Morning. The dog's tail thumped softly once against the wooden floor. Grant carefully removed the bandage Caleb had wrapped the evening before. The swelling remained, but it had stopped growing. He gently ran his fingers along the shoulder. No fracture. Ranger accepted the examination without complaint. Only when Grant flexed the leg forward did the dog pull back slightly. "Sore," Grant murmured. "Not broken." Relief settled quietly between them. For the next 2 days, Grant abandoned every major repair on Iron Horizon. The ship could wait. His partner came first. He boiled water over the camp stove to clean fresh bandages. He mixed canned chicken with rice instead of dry kibble. He carried Ranger's water bowl closer so the dog wouldn't have to walk as far. Every evening they sat together on the forward deck, watching the sun disappear behind the sandstone ridges. Neither needed conversation. The silence had become familiar, comfortable. On the third morning, Ranger surprised him. Grant stepped outside carrying 2 buckets toward the town well. When he reached the gangway, he noticed the dog standing there, weight resting unevenly across 3 legs. Waiting. Grant smiled. "I thought Caleb ordered bed rest." Ranger blinked. "I know, huh? So did the army." The German shepherd slowly walked beside him into town. His limp remained obvious, but each step looked stronger than the last. People noticed. Nora Ellis came out of the bakery carrying warm cinnamon rolls. "He's looking better." Grant accepted one with a quiet thank you. Nora crouched beside Ranger. "You scared all of us." The dog gently accepted a scratch beneath his chin. Across the street, Owen Briggs tipped his coffee mug toward Grant. "Told you." "What?" "Tough old fellow." Grant looked down at Ranger. "I've known that for years." By afternoon, Ranger had grown restless. Not playful, purposeful. Grant recognized the difference. Instead of lying in the engine room, the old dog wandered slowly toward the central staircase. Halfway up, he paused to catch his breath. Grant watched from below. "You sure?" Ranger looked back, then continued climbing. Grant followed several steps behind. The dog reached the upper hallway. His injured shoulder caused a slight hitch in every stride, but he never hesitated. straight past the empty passenger cabins, straight toward the captain's cabin, straight toward Arthur Walker's desk. Grant stopped in the doorway. "You came back." Ranger ignored him. The German Shepherd crossed the room until he stood beside the lower right corner of the desk. The exact same place. He lowered his nose, sniffed once, twice. Then, instead of scratching wildly as before, he touched one precise spot with the tip of his paw. Once. Grant walked over slowly. The dog stepped aside, almost inviting him closer. Grant crouched until his eyes rested level with the wooden panel. The tiny stream of cool air still escaped through an almost invisible seam. He reached for the flashlight. This time he held the beam sideways instead of directly at the wood. A faint shadow appeared. Not a crack, a hairline gap, barely visible. His fingertips traced the edge. Unlike the rest of the desk, this section carried almost no dust inside the seam. It had moved before, long ago. Grant tapped gently. Most of the panel answered with a dull, solid sound. Near the bottom corner, the tone changed. Hollow. He leaned back against his heels. "You're trying to tell me something." Ranger remained perfectly still. Grant smiled faintly. "No." He shook his head. "You're trying to show me." Back downstairs, Grant searched through Arthur's old tool chest. Most of the tools had rusted beyond use. One had not. A narrow cabinet maker's pry knife, thin as a ruler, flexible, designed for delicate work. Exactly what he needed. Back inside the captain's cabin, he slid the blade carefully into the tiny gap. Nothing. He withdrew it, adjusted the angle, tried again. The blade slipped deeper this time, barely half an inch. Grant didn't force it. He gently worked the tool side to side. A tiny click echoed inside the desk. Ranger immediately lifted his head. Grant froze. Another careful movement. The wooden panel shifted almost imperceptibly. Not outward, inward. He set down the pry knife, used both hands, pressed lightly. The hidden panel swung open on a concealed hinge no wider than a paperback novel. A cool breath of trapped air escaped into the room. Grant stared into the narrow compartment. No stacks of cash. No gold coins. No jewels. Only 3 objects rested inside. A small steel key attached to a faded leather tag. A tightly wrapped bundle of handwritten pages tied with cotton string. And a rolled blueprint secured inside a brass tube. Grant reached for nothing. For several long seconds, he simply looked. Someone had hidden these items with extraordinary care. Not to keep them valuable, to keep them safe. He slowly picked up the key first. Stamped into the brass tag were 4 simple words. "Lower paddle service hatch." Grant looked toward Ranger. The old German Shepherd met his eyes quietly, as if to say, "Now you're finally asking the right questions." Grant turned the steel key over in his hand. Its edges were worn smooth from years of use, yet not a trace of rust marked the teeth. Whoever had hidden it had wrapped the compartment tightly enough to keep moisture away for decades. He carefully untied the bundle of handwritten pages before touching the blueprint. The first page carried Arthur Walker's unmistakable handwriting. "If you've reached this compartment, don't assume you've found the answer. You've only found the map." Grant read the line twice. The pages that had been cut from the engineering journal weren't stolen. Arthur had removed them himself. Each page described problems no one else seemed willing to solve. Not steam pressure. Not engines. Water. Groundwater depth. Seasonal runoff. underground limestone channels beneath the dry creek basin. Grant frowned. This wasn't the work of a ship's engineer alone. It looked more like the notebook of a hydrologist. He unrolled the blueprint. The paper cracked softly, but held together. His eyes followed hundreds of precise lines crossing beneath the hull of Iron Horizon. None of them matched the ship. The drawing continued downward, below the keel, below the old riverbed, into the earth itself. He whispered to himself, "This isn't a steamship blueprint." Ranger gave a quiet huff. Grant looked at the brass tag again. Lower paddle service hatch. He knew exactly where that hatch should be. The lower paddle compartment had been sealed since the river disappeared. Grant descended into the engine room. The massive paddle wheel loomed above him like the skeleton of some ancient creature frozen in time. Dust drifted through narrow shafts of afternoon light. He walked around the great iron axle until he found a narrow maintenance passage almost hidden behind support braces. There it was, a steel hatch no larger than a cellar door. Its lock matched the key in his hand. Grant hesitated only a moment. The mechanism turned with a heavy metallic clunk. He pulled. Nothing. The rubber gasket had fused to the frame. He braced one boot against the floor and pulled harder. The seal finally broke with a loud crack. A rush of cool air spilled from the darkness below. Not stale air, cold air. Much colder than the desert above. Grant immediately noticed the temperature difference. His military instincts quietly filed it away. Underground space. Stable climate. Possible natural ventilation. He switched on his flashlight. Steel steps disappeared into darkness. Ranger stood beside him, tail low but steady. Grant rested one hand on the dog's neck. "You stay close." Together they descended. The chamber beneath the paddle wheel surprised him. It wasn't large, perhaps 20 feet across. The walls weren't part of the ship at all. They had been carved directly into sandstone beneath the riverbank decades earlier. Arthur had transformed the natural cavity into a workshop. Shelves lined one wall. Most held rusted tools. Others supported carefully labeled wooden crates. At the center of the chamber stood something covered beneath heavy canvas. Grant pulled the fabric away. Steel pipes, copper valves, cast iron housings. A compact mechanical pump unlike anything he'd seen aboard the ship. Beside it rested another journal. This one bore no engineering calculations, only a title. Project Dry Creek. Grant opened it carefully. The first entry read, "People think I built a stranded steamship. They never understood I was building a water station." His pulse quickened. He continued reading. Arthur explained how the abandoned river still concealed deep groundwater, trapped beneath layers of porous sandstone. The steamship had never been intended as the final invention. It was camouflage. Its enormous boilers could generate enough pressure to drive a pump capable of lifting underground water into storage tanks for the entire valley. Years before anyone spoke of sustainable water systems, Arthur had already designed one. Grant slowly lowered the journal. Outside, the desert looked lifeless. Beneath his feet, enough water might still exist to save it. Another page caught his attention. It had been written years later. They laughed. They said I was chasing ghosts beneath a dead river. The investors left. The county withdrew support. Only one company kept asking to buy the ship. Grant's eyes narrowed. The next line contained a familiar name. Hale Minerals. Not Victor. His father. The entry continued. They don't want the ship. They want what lies beneath it. Grant looked back toward the machinery. Everything suddenly fit together. Victor hadn't offered $25,000 because Iron Horizon was valuable. He offered it because he already knew there was something hidden below. Maybe not every detail, but enough. Enough to keep coming back. Enough to send men with gasoline instead of lawyers. Grant folded the journal shut. His breathing had become slow, controlled, the way it always had before difficult missions. His mind was no longer racing. It was assembling pieces, observing, planning. Ranger suddenly lifted his head. His ears rotated toward the staircase above. The dog remained perfectly still. Then he let out a low, quiet growl. Not loud, not frightened. Warning. Grant immediately extinguished his flashlight. Darkness swallowed the chamber. Both of them listened. From somewhere above, a floorboard creaked. Someone was walking across the engine room. Grant remained perfectly still. The darkness inside the hidden chamber swallowed both him and Ranger. He rested one hand lightly against the old dog's neck. Ranger's growl stopped the instant Grant touched him, but every muscle beneath his fur remained tense. Another creak, slower this time. Whoever was above wasn't wandering. They were searching. Grant quietly slipped Arthur's journal, the blueprint, and the steel key into his backpack. He pulled the canvas back over the mechanical pump exactly as he had found it, leaving no sign that anyone had entered the chamber. Then he extinguished every remaining glimmer of light. The only illumination came through the narrow crack beneath the service hatch. Footsteps crossed directly overhead. Grant recognized the rhythm. 2 people. One heavier than the other. The heavier man paused. Metal scraped against metal. Someone was opening a toolbox. Grant closed his eyes for a brief second. Not fear. Calculation. Back in Afghanistan, every patrol began with one rule. Don't rush toward the unknown. Let the unknown reveal itself first. He waited. A voice drifted through the floorboards. Check the workshop. Another answered. Boss said the papers have to be here somewhere. Grant's jaw tightened. Victor hadn't come looking for the ship. He'd come looking for Arthur's work. Grant leaned close to Ranger's ear. Stay. The old German shepherd never liked that command. Tonight, he obeyed anyway. Grant eased the hatch upward no more than an inch. Enough to see. 2 flashlights swept slowly across the engine room. Their beams crossed benches Grant had spent weeks organizing. One man kicked open a storage cabinet. The other rifled through drawers. Neither noticed the hidden hatch beneath the paddle wheel assembly. Grant silently lowered the hatch again. He wasn't going to confront them. Not yet. Instead, he reached into his backpack and removed a small spool of utility cord. The narrow chamber had another exit. Arthur's blueprint had shown it. A maintenance tunnel leading toward the opposite side of the hull. Grant found the steel handle buried beneath loose sand. The narrow door opened outward with barely a whisper. Fresh night air, Vasson, drifted inside. He motioned once. Ranger followed. Together they disappeared into the darkness beneath the ship without making a sound. They emerged nearly 60 yards beyond the stern. From there, Grant could see the entire iron horizon silhouetted against the stars. 2 flashlight beams still danced through the engine room windows. The intruders believed they were alone. Grant smiled faintly. Sometimes winning meant never letting the other side know where you were. He moved carefully through the dry sagebrush, staying below the ridgeline. Ranger limped beside him but never complained. Grant reached an old fence post overlooking the dirt road. There he unpacked 3 small camping bells from his truck. Nothing military. Just inexpensive brass bells he'd bought weeks earlier at the hardware store. One by one, he stretched fishing line between mesquite bushes around the approaches to the ship. Barely visible. Simple. Effective. Anyone crossing them in darkness would announce themselves. By the time he finished, the 2 men finally climbed out of the engine room. One slammed a cabinet shut in frustration. "I told you nothing's here. The old man's hiding something." They climbed into a pickup parked beyond the riverbed. Its headlights remained off until it reached the county road. Grant memorized the license plate before the truck disappeared. The following morning, he drove into town. Ben Carter spotted him outside the general store. "Mr. Walker?" Grant smiled. "Morning." Ben glanced around before lowering his voice. "I saw that same truck again." Grant stopped. "Where?" "Near the old quarry." "The black pickup?" Ben nodded. "They've been there almost every afternoon." Grant thanked him. Children noticed things adults overlooked. He had learned that long before joining the Army. Owen Briggs arrived just after lunch carrying a new box of carriage bolts. "I heard somebody was snooping around." Grant looked up from repairing a railing. "News travels fast. It does around here." Owen handed him the bolts. "Folks are starting to ask questions." Grant tightened another nut. "They should." The old carpenter looked toward the ship. "You planning to leave?" Grant answered without hesitation. "No." Owen nodded once. "Good." He rested one rough hand against the railing. Arthur didn't. That evening, Grant adjusted every trip line before sunset. He placed lanterns where they illuminated open ground while leaving the approaches themselves in shadow. Nothing elaborate, nothing dangerous, just enough to make anyone approaching feel exposed. Ranger watched every movement. Despite the soreness in his shoulder, he insisted on making the full patrol with Grant. The old routine returned naturally. Check the gangway. Check the stern. Listen. Wait. As darkness settled over Dry Creek, coyotes called somewhere beyond the hills. The wind shifted. Ranger stopped walking. His ears snapped toward the western edge of the basin. A second later, one of the tiny brass bells rang softly in the darkness. Then another. Someone had entered the perimeter again. Grant didn't reach for a weapon. He reached for the lantern. With one quick motion, he lowered the wick until only the faintest glow remained. The deck around him faded into shadow, while the open ground beyond the ship stayed washed in moonlight, exactly as he had planned. Ranger stood beside him, his injured shoulder stiff but steady. The old German shepherd's ears tracked every sound drifting across the basin. Another bell chimed. Closer. Grant whispered, "Hold." The dog remained perfectly still. A figure appeared between two mesquite bushes. Unaware, a nearly invisible strand of fishing line had betrayed every step. Then another silhouette emerged. Both men carried flashlights, but neither turned them on. They were trying to stay unseen. Grant watched without moving. Their eyes swept toward the engine room, toward the captain's cabin, toward the workshop. Not one glance lingered on the old paddle wheel. Arthur had been right. They weren't searching randomly. They were looking for something specific. The first man stepped forward. His boot caught another line. The brass bell rang louder this time. Both intruders froze. "Did you hear that?" "It's just the wind." Grant almost smiled. There wasn't enough wind to move brass. The second man pulled a flashlight from his pocket. The narrow beam swept across the deck. It stopped only inches from Grant's position before drifting away. Ranger's breathing slowed. Grant rested two fingers lightly against the dog's neck. Years ago, before entering uncertain compounds overseas, his team had often waited motionless for minutes at a time. Movement attracted attention. Stillness disappeared into darkness. The flashlight switched off. "We're wasting time. Check the workshop again." The men climbed the gangway. Grant waited until both disappeared inside the ship. Then he quietly circled around the stern. He knew the layout better now than anyone else alive. He reached the engine room through a narrow service entrance and stepped inside without making a sound. The intruders stood 20 feet away, pulling open cabinets. One tossed wrenches onto the floor. The other ripped open crates Grant had carefully organized. Neither noticed the narrow ladder leading upward. Grant climbed silently onto the overhead maintenance catwalk. From there, he could see everything. One man cursed. Nothing. The boss said the papers had to be here. Grant filed away the words. The papers. Not money. Not machinery. Arthur's work. Exactly as he'd suspected. Suddenly, Ranger's head snapped toward one of the side windows. A faint scraping echoed outside. Someone else. Grant counted quickly. Not 2. 3. A lookout remained outside. He leaned toward Ranger. Easy. The German shepherd understood. Instead of barking, he slipped quietly back down the ladder and disappeared into the darkness beneath the catwalk. Seconds later, the lookout walked through the open cargo door. He never saw Ranger until the dog stepped silently into his path. The man jumped backward in surprise. What the? His shout echoed through the engine room. The other two spun around. Grant switched on every lantern hanging from the rafters. Warm light flooded the workshop. The 3 men blinked against the sudden brightness. Grant stood calmly above them on the steel catwalk. I've already called the sheriff. It wasn't true, but they didn't know that. One looked toward the open doorway, another toward Ranger. The German shepherd stood squarely between them and the exit. His lips never curled. He didn't growl. He simply watched. The oldest lesson from his military days still held true. Confidence often accomplished what force never could. The men hesitated only a heartbeat before bolting toward the side windows instead. One smashed a pane with his elbow. Glass exploded across the floor. Ranger lunged instinctively to intercept. A jagged shard sliced across his front leg before Grant could call him back. The dog stumbled, then regained his footing immediately. The 3 intruders disappeared into the darkness outside. Truck doors slammed. An engine roared. By the time Grant reached the deck, only a trail of dust remained beneath the moon. He knelt beside Ranger. Bright red drops dotted the weathered planks. The cut wasn't deep, but seeing fresh blood on the old dog's leg tightened something inside Grant's chest. You stubborn old soldier. Ranger looked up at him and nudged his hand as if nothing had happened. Behind them, another sound echoed across the basin. A bicycle. Ben Carter coasted to a stop near the gangway, breathing hard. I saw them! He shouted. Grant looked up. The boy held a small handheld camcorder against his chest. My dad gave it to me for birdwatching. He swallowed. I recorded their truck when they drove in. Grant stared at him. You got the license plate? Ben nodded, and one of their faces. For the first time since arriving in Dry Creek, Grant felt the balance begin to shift. Victor Hale had spent weeks hiding behind shadows. Now, the shadows had started leaving evidence behind. Grant looked from Ben's trembling hands to the small camcorder. You kept recording? Ben nodded. I got scared. But Dad always says if something doesn't feel right, don't stop paying attention. Grant accepted the camcorder carefully, as though it were made of glass. The grainy screen flickered to life. The image shook as Ben hid behind an old water trough near the road, but it was clear enough. A black pickup, the same license plate Grant had memorized. One man climbing out, another carrying a crowbar. Then, just before the camera dipped toward the ground, the driver's face turned toward the lens. Grant paused the video. He recognized him. One of Victor Hale's foremen. He handed the camera back. You did good. Ben straightened a little. Is Ranger okay? Grant looked down. The old German shepherd sat beside him while Caleb wrapped the shallow cut on his front leg. The dog never complained. Caleb tied off the bandage and smiled. He'll have another scar. Grant rubbed behind Ranger's ears. We've both collected a few. The sheriff arrived just after sunrise. Sheriff Daniel Mercer wasn't a man who rushed to conclusions. He watched the recording twice before speaking. You know who this is? Grant nodded. I've seen him with Victor Hale. The sheriff folded his arms. This doesn't prove Mr. Hale ordered anything. No. Grant looked toward the iron horizon. But it proves someone keeps coming back. Sheriff Mercer nodded slowly. That's enough for me to start asking questions. As he drove away, Grant noticed something he hadn't expected. Several people from town had gathered near the ship, not to stare, to help. Owen Briggs climbed out of his pickup carrying 2 long oak beams. Thought we'd finish replacing that support post. Before Grant could answer, Caleb Morris arrived with fresh steel brackets. I brought the hinges you ordered. Moments later, Nora Ellis appeared with 3 baskets. You boys forget to eat whenever you're working. Grant looked around. Nobody had asked for payment. Nobody had mentioned Victor Hale. Nobody had spoken about the attack. They had simply shown up. For the first time since arriving in Dry Creek, Grant no longer felt like the outsider standing alone on an abandoned ship. Work moved quickly. Owen measured. Grant cut. Caleb drilled. The steady rhythm of hammers echoed across the basin. This time, the sound didn't drag Grant back to Afghanistan. It blended with voices, laughter, coffee cups clinking against toolboxes. The ship no longer sounded empty. By afternoon, the repaired support beam stood perfectly square. Owen stepped back. She'll hold another 100 years. Grant brushed sawdust from his hands. I hope somebody's here to see it. They will. After lunch, Grant carried Arthur's journals into the captain's cabin. The blueprint remained spread across the desk. He studied every note again, every pressure calculation, every elevation mark. One sentence near the bottom caught his attention. Prototype completed. Final test postponed until community reservoir is connected. Community reservoir. Grant frowned. He had never seen one. He walked outside and studied the basin. The abandoned water tower stood near the center of town. Old steel pipes disappeared beneath the dirt road. Arthur hadn't designed a pump for the ship. He had designed one for Dry Creek. The ship had always been only the engine. The town itself was the destination. Grant carefully rolled the blueprint shut. I finally understand. The next morning, he shared Arthur's plans with Owen and Caleb. Neither man interrupted while he explained. When he finished, Caleb leaned over the drawing. My grandfather talked about this. Grant looked up. He did? He said Arthur believed groundwater still flowed beneath the sandstone. Owen chuckled quietly. We all thought he was chasing dreams. Grant traced one finger across the blueprint. He wasn't. Silence settled over the room. Then Caleb smiled. So, when do we start? The following weeks became a blur of work. Old pipes were uncovered one section at a time. Most had survived beneath the dry earth. Others needed replacing. Grant rebuilt valves. Caleb forged missing fittings. Owen repaired supports inside the engine room. Ben became their unofficial apprentice. Every afternoon after school, he hurried to the ship. Grant taught him how to read measuring tapes, how to identify different bolts, how to tighten a fitting without stripping the threads. Ranger supervised every lesson, usually from the shade, sometimes with his head resting across Ben's boots. The old dog still favored his injured shoulder, but each day the limp grew less noticeable. Late one evening, the final connection was ready. Everyone gathered inside the engine room. Grant stood beside the restored pump. His hand rested on the large cast-iron lever Arthur had designed decades earlier. He hesitated. Not because he doubted the machine, because he wished Arthur could see it. Owen quietly nodded. "Go ahead." Grant pulled the lever. For one long second, nothing happened. Then, a deep mechanical thump echoed through the ship. The flywheel shifted. Steel rods moved for the first time in 40 years. Air escaped from old valves with a low hiss. Water rushed through hidden pipes beneath the floor. Everyone listened. Another thump. Then another. Outside, someone shouted. Grant hurried onto the deck. Across the basin, near the old stone reservoir above Dry Creek, a narrow stream of clear water spilled from an iron outlet into the empty basin below. Nobody spoke. The only sound was running water. Grant stood motionless. The steady flow carried him somewhere he hadn't expected. For an instant, he heard another river. The Helmand. Morning mist. Boots crossing a narrow bridge. Then the memory faded. Only the water remained. Warm evening light reflected across the stream as children from town ran toward it, laughing. Ranger walked quietly to Grant's side. The old German shepherd leaned gently against his leg. Neither of them looked at the ship. They watched the water, and for the first time, Dry Creek no longer looked like a forgotten place waiting to disappear. It looked like a town beginning again. The sound of running water spread through the valley long after the sun had slipped behind the red cliffs. Children laughed beside the old stone reservoir. Neighbors who had spent decades hauling buckets simply stood in silence, watching the clear stream spill into the basin Arthur Walker had designed so many years before. No one hurried home. It felt as though the town was afraid the water might vanish if they looked away. Grant rested both hands on the railing of Iron Horizon. Ranger settled beside him, leaning lightly against his leg. The old dog's shoulder had healed into a permanent scar, and the thin white line across his front leg caught the fading light whenever he shifted his weight. Neither scar slowed him anymore. They had simply become part of who he was. Grant understood that better than anyone. The weeks that followed changed Dry Creek one quiet day at a time. Travelers began stopping to see the stranded steamship that had somehow brought water back to the desert. The empty crew cabins became clean guest rooms. Fresh curtains hung in the windows Nora Ellis had helped sew. Owen built sturdy oak beds from reclaimed timber. Caleb forged iron coat hooks, hinges, and lantern brackets that matched the ship's original hardware. The engine room became something entirely new. Part workshop, part classroom, part museum. Grant repaired ranch equipment in the mornings. By afternoon, Ben Carter appeared almost every day carrying a notebook tucked beneath one arm. "What are we fixing today?" Grant would smile. "Depends. Can you tell the difference between a cracked casting and a loose fitting?" Ben usually guessed wrong. Grant never laughed. He simply handed the boy another wrench. "Try again." Nearby, Ranger watched every lesson with patient eyes, occasionally wandering over to inspect Ben's work before lying back down beneath the workbench. People joked that nothing left the shop unless Ranger approved it first. One evening, Sheriff Daniel Mercer drove onto the property. This time, he wasn't alone. 2 state investigators stepped from the truck carrying folders thick with paperwork. Victor Hale's foreman had confessed. Financial records linked Hale Minerals to the repeated break-ins. The company had quietly purchased surrounding land for years, believing Arthur's research pointed toward valuable underground resources. Instead, they had nearly buried something far more important: the attempted arson, the trespassing, the destruction of property. The investigators gathered enough evidence to begin formal proceedings. Sheriff Mercer removed his hat. "You were right to hold on to the ship. Grant looked across the deck. I almost didn't. The sheriff smiled. Most people would have sold. Grant glanced toward Ranger. Most people didn't have someone like him reminding them to stay. Autumn arrived with cooler mornings. The desert grasses shimmered silver beneath the wind. Grant found himself sleeping through entire nights. Sometimes he still woke before dawn. Old habits lingered. He would step onto the deck carrying a mug of coffee, while Ranger padded quietly beside him. But something had changed. The pounding heartbeat that used to greet every unexpected sound no longer arrived. The wind through the rigging sounded like wind, not rotor blades. The slam of a loose hatch sounded like old wood, not incoming fire. The silence inside his mind had begun returning one sunrise at a time. Late one afternoon, while replacing a cracked window in the captain's cabin, Grant noticed something unusual. The narrow wooden trim beside the frame sat slightly proud of the wall. He removed 2 tiny brass screws. The strip came free. Hidden behind it rested a single folded envelope. His name wasn't written on the front. Instead, it read, "For the one who stayed." Grant unfolded the yellowed paper carefully. Arthur Walker's handwriting filled the page. If you are reading this, then you chose patience over profit. You repaired before you replaced. You listened before you judged. That means this ship finally found the person I hoped would inherit it. Grant swallowed quietly. Outside, he could hear Ben laughing somewhere below deck. Arthur continued. People believed I left behind an old steamship. I never cared about the ship. I cared about the kind of person who would refuse to abandon it. Machines can always be rebuilt. Towns can recover. Even rivers sometimes find new paths. The hardest thing to restore is a person's belief that they still belong somewhere. Grant lowered the letter. The room remained perfectly still. Only the ticking of the old wall clock echoed softly in the cabin. As evening settled over Dry Creek, lanterns flickered to life one by one. Guests gathered in the dining room below. Someone played an old upright piano rescued from a neighboring ranch. Children chased each other across the deck where dust and silence had ruled only months before. Grant carried Arthur's letter to the captain's desk. Beside it, he placed 2 objects: his army identification tags, Arthur's brass whistle. One represented the life he had survived. The other represented the life he had found. Ranger walked into the cabin and settled in the doorway, facing outward exactly as he had done countless nights overseas. Still standing watch. Only now, the place behind him wasn't a temporary outpost. It was home. Grant looked through the front windows. Warm lights glowed throughout Dry Creek. Water shimmered beneath the moon. Voices drifted upward with the evening breeze. For years, he had believed surviving was the best a man could hope for after war. Arthur had quietly proven otherwise. A person could build again. A town could begin again. Even a forgotten steamship stranded in the middle of the desert could become the heart of a community. Grant rested one hand on Ranger's neck. The old German shepherd looked up at him, his eyes calm, steady, and utterly certain. For the first time since leaving Afghanistan, Grant no longer felt like he was guarding the memory of a life that had ended. He was standing watch over the life that had finally begun. If Grant and Ranger's journey meant something to you, I'd love to hear from you. Just leave a 1 in the comments if you believe loyalty and perseverance can change a life. Or leave a 0 if you think everyone deserves a second chance, no matter how broken their past may be. I read as many of your comments as I can, and your stories often inspire the next ones we tell. If you enjoyed this story, please take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next unforgettable journey of courage, hope, and the extraordinary bond between people and their loyal dogs. Until next time, thank you for spending your time with us. Take care of yourselves, take care of those who stand beside you, and never underestimate the value hidden inside something the rest of the world has given up on.